Welcome to the Zandbergen Report, where wealth strategies and pop culture collide, featuring your distinguished host and certified financial planner, Bart Zandbergen.
Welcome to our show of dream chasers and wealth makers. We are thrilled to be back in the studio today with a new episode of the Zandbergen Report. I'm proud to bring in the movers, shakers, and difference makers who are passionate about what they have learned and what you need to know today. And today I'm very pleased to have repeat guests, Katie and Andy Cherkasky. Hey guys, thanks for being on the show today.
I'm so excited to be back. Thanks
it's
for
great
having
to
us.
be back.
Yeah, awesome. And if that name rings a bell to anyone, and for those who are looking at YouTube, you might recognize both of them as they are frequent contributors on Fox News, CNBC, Fox Business. I see you guys all the time. Now, do you ever get stopped on the street and someone recognize you?
No.
Not once?
No, but
Not
you know
once?
what's funny is I do get a lot of followers and things like that after every
yeah.
news hit. So when I'm on, then a random rush of people will find me online.
That makes sense.
That's about it. But even that's kind of going a little far for a random news commentator.
I like when my friends send me a picture from the gym, like old days, I guess. They're at the gym and they see me come
snap a
on.
picture.
Yeah, right.
That's
About as much as you get.
No, there's not a lot of fame to be had with it, right?
Well, for those who didn't hear them first time around, their background is actually pretty amazing. First of all, they have 5 kids, and they're all young. So that alone is amazing that they were able to pull that off. And they're owners of a prestigious law firm in Orange County, and that focuses on complex federal litigation, including some of our nation's most serious criminal and civil rights cases. Andy and Katie have remarkably similar backgrounds. They both began their careers as officers in the U.S. Air Force. They both also served as federal prosecutors. Sorry about that. Between the two of them, they successfully prosecuted murderers, rapists, and international drug smugglers. That's my jam.
I remember that about you, Bart. Yes, we've got lots of crime stories for you.
God, I'm going to pick up your podcast. Okay, so in addition to running their international law firm, they are both, as I mentioned, regular commentators on Fox, CNBC, and Fox Business, as well as contributing editorial writers for USA Today. They host a very engaging podcast called Legally Bound, where they discuss love, law, and politics. And some of their most popular podcast episodes include interviews with past clients discussing their incredible crime stories. Again, that's my jam. In addition, they have a growing library of in-depth consumable videos on big legal and political issues on their YouTube channel, Legally Blondish.
That's right.
Great name. All right. So much is going on, and I know we don't have a limited time, so I want to start with probably the most current. And like Katie said, I mentioned, Katie, I only caught 15 seconds of you with Neil Cavuto the other day. But this whole GameStop, Robinhood, Reddit, I think for some people it's probably very confusing.
Oh, yeah. I saw a lot of people were kind of just wanting to know what happened. So I think, you probably can explain that better than I can in terms of the actual stock market piece of it. So, yeah, it was crazy. Yeah.
So I really want to focus on the legal, but I think for the benefit of the listeners, I'm just going to describe what kind of the basic concept is. And so what you may have heard, if you know anything about this topic, is short selling. Right, and that's what kind of caused this whole thing. And again, this isn't an endorsement of one thing or another. It's just a definition of short selling. So someone who wants to sell a stock short will go to their broker and say, I want to borrow a share of stock or share multiple shares of stock. I will pay you someday. In the meantime, I'll pay interest on those shares. And the hopes of the person who is selling short is that they will be able to buy the stock later at a lower price. Okay. So with that kind of horizon, what happened?
Yeah, it was incredibly crazy. So like you said, there was a bunch of short sellers, hedge funds and things of this sort that wanted to sell this GameStop stock short. And there's a group online on a website called Reddit. So it's kind of a forum or community kind of forums. And one of the forums was talking about Wall Street bets. And essentially what happened was this group of people got upset, or at least that's so the story goes. They got upset that these hedge funds were trying to short GameStop. They're all gamers. They like GameStop. They wanted to bet big on it. And so they had this plan, which ultimately overthrew these hedge funds to essentially increase the value of the stock.
I think
So they
that's the
bought
most hilarious part, is that you've got a bunch of gamers online who get upset over the idea that their beloved GameStop and it could go under. That's what people are doing. They're betting against this company, this retail brick and mortar, from succeeding, and they're so offended by this that they want to essentially save this GameStop business. I don't know, but that's what happens, and then they put them in a short squeeze.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, because this online forum caused the stock price to skyrocket, then all of these hedge funds suddenly were losing money by the second, literally, because the price was going up and they were going to have to pay on all those shares. So that was only part of the story, though. The bigger part of the story was really what happened when these retail investors, right, wanted to keep buying more shares. And then that brings in this app called Robinhood, which basically is used by a lot of people to trade because there's not fees and things like this. So suddenly Robinhood, who bills themselves as being this kind of common man's like forum for trading
platform,
shuts off the ability to buy any more GameStop shares. They say you can only sell, no more buying. They shut it off completely, and people just go crazy because essentially there was people that wanted to keep buying shares. There was the idea that they were essentially making the stock price rise up through all this buying, and suddenly they cut it off. So people were like, what the heck happened here? What's happening? So that's where you get into the legal stuff, right?
And that's really where the legal stuff comes in, because what you have to understand is what was going on. So the company is over-shorted. So it's 100+% are in short positions. So that means it's very difficult for people to buy their way out of their short. And that on the other side, somebody needs to sell. And the whole idea with this Reddit group is that they were holding strong and they wanted to run this price up infinitely, with ideas of it going to $1,000 or $10,000. I think they said at one point that if they could get the number to something like $32,000 a share, that it would actually bankrupt Wall Street itself. Because with a normal stock, when you buy a stock at $100, if it goes to zero, you lost $100.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if you short a stock at $100, you can lose infinitely, because it can just keep going up and up. You're borrowing it. It's on credit. And so when it goes to 200, now you've lost $100. But when it goes to 1,000 or 10,000, you've lost infinitely more, plus all of the interest in the time that it took you to sell it. I'm not going to do that math for you, but it puts it in the many, 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 many billions. Dozens or maybe even hundreds of billions are being lost by these hedge funds because they're being squeezed and can't sell. So they're trying to do whatever they can, presumably, to get that stock price back lower. And if Robinhood was in cahoots with them, which is potential, and we'll talk about that potential, but if Robinhood is in cahoots and they allow you only to sell it, now people are going to realize other people aren't going to be able to buy. Obviously, people are going to get panicked and sell, driving all of those Robinhood users, those retail users, out of the market, driving the prices lower. That's the only logical explanation for why you'd kind of make the trade on one side. To me, we've got billions on the line. Bart, how many years would you go to jail for $1 billion?
I would say the rest of my life.
Maybe you want to get out for a few minutes, maybe to enjoy. But yeah, I mean, $1 billion is even enough to sacrifice. Just let it be legacy.
I thought I misunderstood the question.
To rob a bank for $1 billion.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm not going to answer that question.
Right. But thank you. That's a good idea. As a criminal defense attorney, I put you in a tough position.
I would say, most people would take some time behind bars.
I think a lot of people
if it would work out. But so the point is, I think, because you kind of didn't really say what you're talking about. The idea on the legal side, after all the discussion of what this all means, is what did Robinhood do? They shut off the selling or the buying, right? You could only sell.
Right.
And so they say now there's some excuses being lodged about, well, we were oversaturated, we were just overwrought, the system wasn't prepared for this. We couldn't because we had clearinghouse requirements, all this sort of regulatory stuff. And that's why. Is that true? Well, I think we'll all find out. And then the second question is, or did they do it intentionally because Robinhood, this platform, is really in cahoots with these hedge funds, because these hedge funds are big investors in this app in particular. So that's the question on what I would say the criminal side, or even the regulatory side, because the SEC can find these companies, millions upon millions of dollars. So if there's any evidence that Robinhood and their CEO and leadership was speaking to any of these hedge funds that were in short positions, that there's going to be a bad look. It's going to look like there's some conspiracy to shut out these retail investors, which is market manipulation. I think it would be proven to be in that point, don't you think?
I was just going to ask, it sounds like market manipulation.
Yeah, well, I think you've got two different ways to look at it. You've got a market manipulation potential prosecution, which is much more focused, kind of SEC regulatory, tends to be in the fine side of things, but you can see jail time for that type of crime. But I think that that crime requires some degree of intent. You see that in like pump and dump type of situations where people pump up a stock and get out before others think they did. Actually doesn't happen. There's no pump and dump law against bad talking a short position that you have. So you can do a reverse pump and dump. That's not legal advice in all circumstances, but generally speaking, that's the same law.
The idea is that you're talking about the valuation of the company and why you think it's overvalued. You're allowed to say that, essentially. Yeah.
So on one hand, you have market manipulation, but the other side of it is the same law that prosecuted people with college admission scandal, and it's called honest services fraud, and it's a type of mail fraud. The idea that crossing state borders, you're promising some sort of service, and you're doing it with some degree of fraud. And so, Robinhood keeps pointing to their contract that says, "Oh, we can cancel and." Change things in the terms last minute.
We can terminate trades like whenever we want for any or no reason, that sort of stuff.
So you've got people talking like contract law, like it says here, you consented to this. But really, if the act is fraudulent, if you're serving a criminal purpose in doing so, you can't agree to illegal terms in a contract.
What is the process to determine whether this was then fraudulent or there was that intent?
Right. So that's exactly the question. So now, you hear from Congress, there's a lot of people calling for investigations. The SEC is doing investigations. And then there's going to be the DOJ, whether the U.S. attorneys, and I think there are a few U.S. attorneys that said they were looking into this, they're all going to do these investigations to essentially look at what happened, why did they shut off trading on this stock or on a particular amount of stocks, why did that happen? Was it really because they didn't have the money? Should they have had the money? Was that like reckless enough in and of itself? Or was it more sinister? Which I think, we can say if it was, and if there, in my mind, and I think Andy as well, we've talked about it, if there was any evidence of collusion or conspiracy, then I think it is criminal. I think that is criminal. I don't see any other way around it.
Yeah, I'm actually even stronger on that. You hear like Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports, or even Mark Cuban. Those guys are real fired up about it. I am
outspoken about it.
Yeah, I am too. I think Katie's a little bit more conservative on what will happen because I think she's right. From a practical perspective, we don't see evidence right now that the U.S. attorneys, where you would expect them to be, are jumping down this like they could have been raiding Robinhood's office Thursday or Friday of last week. I mean, they could have been there shutting it all down like, Wolf of Wall Street style. Yeah. I think they should have. I mean, I don't mean to talk too much by way of kind of what's going on in politics in America right now, but, we tragically saw George Floyd die at the hands of police officers this summer. That was over an allegation that he had passed a counterfeit $20 bill. The police were on it and they're arresting it. If you look back at what happened last week, if there's not equally as much suspicion, I mean, why else close down just one side of the trading like that with so much that Robinhood has on the line? They've got an upcoming IPO and all sorts of different things moving with them. And the idea that so much is on the line, and if they could get that price down at all, people were saving tens of billions of dollars. And I think
there's a lot of incentive to do that. I mean, it's going to have to be, show us the receipts here. If you're telling me that you had to shut this down, that it was shut down because it was impossible to not.
Yeah.
Which, again, might be culpable in and of itself, but not quite as criminal. But I would be surprised if they weren't making some decisions here.
Well, and I think that's where, even if it's not an intent to commit the crime itself, if they took a shortcut, if they didn't have enough money to fund the things that they were into, you could still see that honest services fraud, that same idea, like parents were helping their kids cheat on the SAT, and so they went to jail on that. I mean, that's not a federal thing that they are usually involved in, but same sort of thing. So if they didn't have enough money and it showed that they were being fraudulent in how they were moving that around and representing that they could do these great trades for people, they're in big trouble.
So, and I say this without any political bent at all, but free market, right? At the end of the day, let the market go where it goes, right?
Well, that's what we all thought until it looks like there's some different rules for, market makers and regular people. So I don't know. I think that's probably the problem here. But it's interesting because right now it seems like it's like all regulatory. So I don't know. But
You know what seems ironic? Robinhood. Right?
Well,
Take from the rich, give
that's
to the
what they were
poor.
saying.
Exactly.
It feels.
They confronted. I mean, Cuomo interviewed the CEO, and he confronted him about that. I mean, the fact that it was like very ironic, of course.
Yeah.
But this guy's been giving interviews left and right.
Ugh.
The
As a
CEO of
criminal
Robinhood,
defense attorney,
it's
I got to
it's
tell him to
horrible
stop.
watch, 'cause
It makes me think that his general counsel don't have experience in criminal law, because if I was the general counsel looking at this case, and maybe this is the lesson to be learned, if you're hiring a general counsel, you want him to have at least some good criminal law background. Because if I was looking at the case from a criminal defense perspective, I would be very nervous. I would be very concerned about every word that's uttered, about every email that was sent, every Slack communication, however anything went out there, I would be terrified. And even if nothing was out there, I'd still be terrified about what was to come, because it looks like a bank robbery.
Yeah.
If I was a prosecutor in a U.S. attorney office, and we used to be former federal prosecutors, if I was sitting in one of those offices right now, my boss would have to be calming me down.
You'd be salivating.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be very excited. Right, exactly.
So what legal lessons should investors take away from this?
Wow. Well, I think we have to see how things sort of play out here, because if this was just a glitch, if it was an honest mistake, I guess then there's not a lesson. But it's interesting to see how people on the internet can come together and do something like this. I mean, I don't know why everyone was so surprised, but I think it was the first time that, these hedge funds got basically punked.
Yeah.
It's like internet punked.
Yeah,
Right.
internet
Yeah.
pumps. I mean, it's pretty massively impressive, and it's kind of funny, really, but crazy.
As long as you don't have a position.
I mean,
in
as
it.
long as you're not involved, right? Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
no kidding, right? But yeah, it definitely is surprising because it was so uncommon. It's never happened before.
Well, there's the great onion squeeze of like the 1950s or something, where honestly, there's now law that prevents this sort of thing from happening, because there was one case, 60, 70 years ago. I can't remember if it was the 60s or 50s, but there was a situation where there was a squeeze on onions. And so now you can no longer short onions in some way, or options, or I don't know exactly.
Even today,
the detail. It's still a law. So we'll see whether the law comes out on this. I think the lesson here is with regard to risk in the market. I mean, you have to note that even where things have never showed up as a problem before, if you're in a risky venture like a short, that it has these possibilities. And I will tell you that the people who are trading in those hedge funds, they know. I mean, I remember the first time I bought a short, you get all these warnings, and it's, you kind of realize, oh, whoa, this is different. I mean, they understand the nature of what a short squeeze is. It's kind of taught, I think, to some degree as this great legend of what can happen.
Yeah.
So, risk. I think that's the lesson.
Yeah. And I'll add to that. It reminds me of one of kind of my favorite just principles in investing is hope is not a strategy.
That's good for a lot of industries.
I think I'm going to make that part of our what we tell our clients.
Wow. Yeah, I'm
trial.
definitely taking that. I like that.
All right. Well, we have time. Let's we do have time. We have a few more minutes. Okay. Also, relatively recent, a couple of weeks ago, the Capitol riots.
Yeah.
So again, let's not get political. That's not what this is all about. But there was some legal issues that happened. Were you actually? I don't know. Were you interviewed on that? Did you have?
Yeah. Andy and I actually co-authored an editorial for USA Today about the Capitol riots, and I mean the essence of that on the legal side is that the people that stormed the Capitol and other people that believe certain ideas about the election. Okay, so that's where it all stemmed from, is that there was challenges initially lodged to the election results by Donald Trump and by supporters. Now, I'm all for challenging elections, and we mentioned this in the article as well, that, American people have to feel confident in the outcome of the elections, and that, there has to be inquiry into allegations of abuse or fraud or anything like that. And that's all legitimately true. You should look into those things. And if true, then, things can be undone if that's proven. But in this case, as we all have seen at this point, the election has been challenged many times. There's many courts that have determined, hey, there's nothing that happened here that's actionable. And that's because there was not enough evidence presented to sustain that. And I believe that personally. I mean, I comment on Fox News. I'm considered a right-wing commentator to some degree, right? But the reality is that, the law is what it is. And so people were told, supposedly, by Rudy Giuliani and some other attorneys on the Trump team that there was still these viable legal angles to go after the election and that this was all fraud. That was not true. So to the extent that people were being kind of given misinformation or disinformation legally, I think that's very, very unfortunate. And I think that's more than unfortunate. I think that's really not right. So we talked about that a lot. So,
and it's really the focus on why, even though Katie has taken very much consistent right-leaning political positions on Fox News, and I have too in some instances, although I'm a little bit more moderate. But the idea was, look, the legal challenges were all legitimate, and they were looking at a couple of things. Was there fraud? But even if there was fraud, was it in the quantity that it would have to be in order to reverse things? And there are these very specific legal standards, and there's reasons why it didn't make it to the Supreme Court and whatnot because of those very specific facts. And so while there were concerns and while there was evidence of fraud in certain places in certain quantities, it was never enough from the view of any of these many, many multitudes of courts. Yet you still had attorneys, which I think bothers us because as much as the stories are told about attorneys, we do have very specific ethical obligations, to be honest, in our brokering and our representation of the law. And so it is very concerning to see that sort of misinformation that ultimately led to violence. And now we'll see if that leads to the conviction of Donald Trump.
So let's talk about that. So impeachment. So this is the kind of the follow-up to that. I did not have a clear understanding of what impeachment is. I won't say is. So impeachment is the beginning of a trial or initiation of a.
Think of it like an indictment. It's the formal bringing of the charges from one house, from Congress, and it's sending it over to the Senate to actually hold the trial. So the Congress gets to send them to trial, and then the Senate gets to hold the trial.
Okay, so it's not a guilty verdict. It's just the beginning of a trial.
You're right. So that's why you can hear people say, oh, he was impeached. Because he was impeached because the House voted to impeach. And that's kind of the first part of that process. And then you have to be convicted in the Senate to actually face consequences for that.
So if anyone is convicted at the end of an impeachment process, what is that term called? Or is it still impeached?
You've been. Oh,
I actually don't know.
You've been convicted.
I think you've just been convicted at an impeachment trial.
You stumped two wordsmiths. This is what we do. We come up with words all day.
I would think there'd be a term, but I am not familiar.
Okay.
But yes, so if he is in fact convicted, the question here, of course, is, well, he's not in office. So
what happens?
We all know that the big push is that he could never be in office,
Right.
and that would be why they're furthering this
Which
impeachment.
seems to be the motivation for this impeachment.
That's what
correct?
they say. That's what they say.
Now, in your humble legal opinions, did he do anything that was an impeachable offense?
Oh, impeachable offense, that's a whole different the idea of an impeachment is political. And so it is no longer about specific elements of a specific criminal code that have to be proven. So it's not a truly legal question as long as it fits the general definition of what an impeachment can be for, which is high crimes, misdemeanors, and other things like seditious types of acts. It
Right.
has
So in this case,
discrediting the office, basically.
Right, exactly.
Yes.
So they did it, and the terms, if true, if he incited an insurgence on the Capitol, sure, that's, I think, unarguably a potential reason to be convicted in an impeachment. But the idea is, was it criminal? So, first, does he have a First Amendment right to how he's speaking? You can't yell out fire in a crowded theater. You can't incite people.
There's
you can't
still
cause
limitations
people to
on
go,
what you can say, even though we have freedom of speech, even
Sure.
in public spheres, right? Yeah, like Andy's saying.
I think it's a little bit of a stretch. If I was prosecuting him in a criminal case, if it was kind of more just based on those facts, I think it would be tough to get a conviction on him. I think somebody like a Rudy Giuliani, who was more on a stage directing people to march and saying it at the same time that he's spreading false information, that's a different analysis. And so there hasn't been a move at this point yet that I've seen to formally prosecute Rudy Giuliani, although there have been discussions of it. But I think between the two of them, he is more culpable than
if at all.
President
I mean,
Trump.
the defense is it was all pre-planned. There's no incitement unless
that's true.
and because you couldn't incite a pre-existing event.
So if the group already had planned to do it,
then you didn't incite them to. Yeah.
but are you then part of the conspiracy?
Yeah, so you can charge it different ways. I mean, they could be creative, but I think the evidence, and this is based on what I heard from Trump's new legal team.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah, he had a changeover at the last minute.
Yeah.
That's going to be a big part of the defense. This is pre-planned. There's tons and tons of message boards and back and forth communications. This was all very elaborately planned. Trump's words are very. If you're talking about the specific words, they're going to be far. Stretching those to reach that. But like Andy said, Giuliani's a lot more on point about it. I mean, I think he even said, what was his specific quote? It was like trial by something.
Oh, yeah. Trial by combat.
Yeah, that's pretty.
That was his call.
Trial by combat.
This should be resolved by trial by combat.
Literal,
that is a call to arms. That's a call to violence.
Yeah.
That's a real problem.
I feel like, that's much more
I don't think
culpable.
Rudy Giuliani was doing President Trump any good when he was in office. I think his new legal team, I heard some of their arguments today. They're cogent. I mean, they're avoiding the ideas of bashing the election itself, and they're now turning more to the politics of
the
doing
correct
this.
strategy.
Exactly. And I think that's, as long as they're able to keep that tone, that'll probably be just fine for them and successful for former President Trump.
How long do you think this will go on?
Well, I'm not really sure. I think it's supposed to start soon, the trial, in next week or something. So I think
Bart, we need them to keep talking about it because that will feed additional appearances on Fox News. Now we know how news is made, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it should be pretty quick. But there's also the argument of, can they even impeach a president who's not in office? That's another strategy I heard. But I'm not familiar enough to comment on that myself.
All right.
I think they're going to do it anyway, whether they can or not. And the Supreme Court maybe will say later on, no, you can't actually do that. But right?
Well, it should be interesting.
We'll see.
Should be interesting. We've got a few minutes. Can you indulge me with a few minutes of a great murder, drug, any sort of a story, either recent or old?
Sure.
Yeah.
I love it just right off the top.
Well, Katie had. We'll do it as a pitch to our show as well. Our podcast, Legally Bound. I think our very best, most interesting episode is a 2-part episode where we talk about our client, Colonel Dan Wilson, who was convicted wrongfully at trial, not with us at his side, but Katie represented him through his appeal and convinced the appellate court to undo his conviction. And it dealt with a very serious, very heinous allegation of child-related sexual offenses. And Katie was able to prove a man who had been convicted innocent. And it was something special. So, Katie, tell just a little bit of that story.
And so on our podcast, we actually did a 2-part interview. So Dan actually tells his story all the way through kind of the legal process, and a lot of people have really enjoyed listening to it because he was exonerated by the appellate court. So he was a very senior ranking officer in the military and was convicted of a child-related offense and was in prison when he hired us. And we went through the appellate process, and he was actually determined by the court to have not been guilty, not on a legal technicality, but this is very interesting in the military courts. They actually have a way that the appeals court can relook at all the evidence, kind of like another jury, and make a new determination about whether the evidence was enough to support a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. And the court here said no, that absolutely not. The evidence was not sufficient enough. And so it wasn't just that, yes, he got out because the prosecutors screwed up or something. It was literally a determination of exoneration, which is very rare. So that story is very, I think, inspiring to a lot of people.
What was the hook?
Yeah.
What do you think you were able to? What fact showed the appellate court that the trial jury got it wrong?
It was very interesting because the court actually came back on a completely different theory than we had even presented. It was kind of a combination of theories, but it was based on all of the pretrial interviews of the child victim, alleged victim, non-victim. And basically the inconsistencies, because there was so many inconsistencies. And when you're, being a witness in a trial, you don't have to always be perfect. Everything doesn't have to be always consistent, but there comes a point when there's too much inconsistency between statements that the courts cannot rely upon it. The credibility is completely diminished. And in this case, there was 4 separate statements that were each inconsistent in and of themselves, and 2 of them did not describe a crime at all. So to the extent that the courts below were picking and choosing the statements to rely on, the appellate court said that would not suffice. And that's kind of the legal technical way to say, yes, the witness was giving multiple versions of stories, and some were criminal, some were not, all over the place, and it was insufficient, even for a child witness, which is a different standard, of course. But
Sure.
Yeah, and so it was a crazy story.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. You should.
Yeah.
I'm going to check it out.
It's worth checking out. And when you get into all the details and understand, what goes into a trial like this, and all of the participants and all of the people who have their whole hearts and lives into it, and then this man went to jail. He was in jail for 3 years, and to hear his story about how he maintained faith in it all, it's quite inspirational.
Wow.
And to hear Katie explain it as she did here, that's one thing. To see the brief and to see every word that was labored over and every part of that record, to get a case overturned, it's remarkable. So we go over that on the show. People should definitely tune in. If you like a true crime story, that's one that is that's really special.
All right, that's next up on my morning listen, Legally Bound. All right, I know we're out of time. Guys, thank you so much for being part of the show today.
I love being on the show.
Super
Thank
excited.
you for
That's
having
great.
us.
And it's great to see you.
Yeah, you too. It's been a while.
Right? I know.
How can people reach you or connect with you?
Our law firm is Golden Law, so you can find us online at goldenlawinc.com. But really check out our YouTube page, which is Legally Blondish. There's really great clips up there. Our podcast, Legally Bound. It's a lot of fun. We talk about all sorts of things. We talk about these legal stories. We talk about some of the politics, but from a way that isn't overly political. We kind of talk about the education behind it and how we form some views that aren't affiliated with any party specifically. So that's nice. And then we talk a little bit about our personal life. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The more people that listen, the better.
Yeah, for sure. And I know we got the name Legally Blondish from you, Andy, right?
Yeah, right.
It's obvious.
My gray hair.
It's his channel.
Katie's great on that channel, though. She has really amazing videos where she educates on basic civil rights, and it's really cool. A lot of people who wouldn't typically be interested in it have given unbelievable feedback about just how cool it is to understand some of these things that we talk about, like Fourth Amendment rights or your rights to remain silent, just basic fundamental things that you kind of know from grade school, or you hear about it kind of in the news, and until you really hear it from a seasoned criminal defense attorney, you don't really understand it. So it's really great content.
Awesome. Can't wait. All right, guys. Again, thanks again.
Thanks,
and I want to thank
Bart.
everyone who's tuned in this week. We look forward to being back in the studio next week. Cheers.
Tune in next week for the latest edition of the Zandbergen Report, Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Catch up on our recent shows by visiting podcast.bartzandbergen.com. The Zandbergen Report is also available on iTunes, iHeartRadio and Spotify. Interested in being a featured guest on our show, or have a question you'd like to hear us answer? Email podcast@bartzandbergen.com. The contents of this podcast episode do not constitute an offer of securities or a solicitation of an offer to buy securities, and may not be relied upon in making an investment decision related to any investment offering Access Wealth Management LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. Access does not warrant the accuracy or completeness of the information contained herein. Opinions are our current opinions and are subject to change without notice. Prices, quotes, rates are subject to change without notice. Generally, investments are not FDIC insured, not bank guaranteed, and may lose value. Brokerage services are offered through Tessera Capital, member FINRA.